Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. This month, we celebrate the fourth anniversary of Governor Cooper's Executive Order 92, Employment First for North Carolinians with Disabilities. Today, the order reflects the state's goal of being a leader in recruiting and creating an inclusive work environment for individuals with disabilities. We are pleased that you have joined us for today's anniversary celebration. Today, we have litigator Katerina A. Kalan for an insightful session on best practices in recruiting and retaining individuals with disabilities and provide tips on how employers can avoid costly employment litigation and personnel issues. Before we go further into today's program, I would like to do some housekeeping. ASL interpreters and CART captioning will be available for this event. To view the captioning, please click on the multimedia viewer button on the panel. If you have issues viewing the captioning, please send a message to the host. As always, keep your microphones on mute throughout the entire session. Please send all of your questions to the chat room. The chat room will be monitored, and we will make sure to answer all of your questions, and they will be forwarded in an orderly fashion. This session will be recorded, and you will be able to view this program later on demand. Speaking of on-demand recordings, you will be notified soon of today's program's availability and all of our recent programs as they are ready to be viewed. We are pleased to announce the following upcoming programs. Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, the program will be on May the 4th, and Military Appreciation Month program will be on May the 8th. We look forward to seeing you there. I'm going to turn the program over to my colleague at OSHR, Lisa Coffey, and she will introduce today's speaker. Lisa?
Thank you, Wendy. Katerina Kulin is an employment-focused litigator and investigator with a background in labor and employment litigation. She collaborates with employers to help them avoid costly labor and employment litigation and personnel issues. She concentrates much of her legal practice on the mergers and acquisitions of companies, including asset and stock purchases, with an eye to the myriad of employment issues inherent in corporate transactions. Katerina also counsels clients on day-to-day employment matters, including standard policies and employee handbooks, employment agreements, severance agreements, termination, retention and recruitment practices, disciplinary procedures, and requests for accommodations. Alongside her traditional labor and employment work, she is the co-founder of the Hirsch Blackwell's Workplace Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Practice Group. Katerina and her team look at the intersection of DEIA best practices and civil law rights, providing clients with risk assessments, performing pay equity analysis, offering training, and drafting strategic plans. Katrina works with clients in all stages of DEIA planning, from those who need a program built from scratch to organizations with advanced initiatives looking for fine-tuning. It is my pleasure to turn the program over now to Katerina Kolan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you so much, Wendy. We can transition to the first slide. That's perfect. First of all, I'd like to say I'm so incredibly impressed already with the structure of this presentation. It is far and above one of the most inclusive formatting I've seen right off the bat. So great job, everyone. I'm super excited to be here for this Lunch and Learn, particularly on the anniversary of Executive Order number 92, which was just such an incredibly important initiative on behalf of the state. So looking at our agenda, we're going to start off with an introduction. We'll dive into some definitions and key concepts. We will go over the legal framework and some best practices in recruitment and best practices in retention. And then we will leave some time at the end for questions. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so What I like to do before I get started on the nitty-gritty of my presentations is show you a little bit of who I am, so that you know that this is a topic that's near and dear to me despite having made it part of my profession. So my name is Katerina Colon. I am a Wisconsin native. My father was born in Puerto Rico, so I am biracial. My mother is white and she was born in Wisconsin. My pronouns are she, her. And on the slides, you're going to see some pictures of my life. So I married my partner last summer in August. His name is Brandon, and he's doing his psych residency right now in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So it's a very busy time for us. He's in the photo on the far left. And then moving over to the picture on the bottom center, that is a photo of me with my sister, Brittany. She works for the University of Wisconsin-Madison system. And in my lap is my nephew, Kingston. And Kingston is an extremely unique young man. So he has a Q18 deletion with extra material on his 9th chromosome. He is the only known individual with this diagnosis. And so it is a very exciting, it's a very exciting thing for us to navigate because he's constantly defeating obstacles that are put before him and teaching us so much in the process, and his medical providers, because he's just a bit of a miracle. Moving to the far right picture on the bottom of the screen, those are two of my dogs. Silas is the fluffy one with the reddish golden hair. Loki is the American bully who is passed out, as he usually is. They are two of the loves of my life. If you move up to the center in the middle of the top of the screen, that is Odin. I call him my firstborn. And he just turned 8. He's also an American bully, another love of my life. And then in the top right corner, that is Killian. He is my other nephew and Kingston's brother. He is deaf in his right ear. And so we are also learning so much with him. He just turned 4, and we're learning how to navigate this space of having a child who is hard of hearing. So that's a little bit about me, and hopefully gives you some insight into why this topic is just so important to me. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to start with some definitions and key concepts, and while it might seem a little bit elementary, I think it's so important because a lot of people, while we know the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we might not know how to define it. Next slide. So when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about people's individual differences. So that can include personality, language, learning styles, life experiences, your abilities. So group and social differences, age, race, ethnicity, class, gender. And we recognize those all as protected characteristics, but diversity is so much broader than that. And there are so many different dimensions of diversity. And so when I talk about diversity, I'm talking about all dimensions of diversity, not just, racial diversity or ethnic diversity. Equity is the state where everyone has a level playing field, regardless of their ethnic background, their age, or their gender. And we're going to address equity a little bit more in just 2 slides. Finally, inclusion is the degree to which diverse individuals are able to engage fully in organizational processes while bringing their authentic selves to the workplace. We want to create a psychologically safe workplace so that our employees feel as included as possible. Moving on to the next slide. And accessibility. We don't want to forget accessibility, right? That's why we're all here today. Accessibility is the design, construction, development, and maintenance of facilities, information and technology, programs and services so that all people, including people with disabilities, can fully and independently use them. Next slide. Now, a lot of times we get equity and equality mixed up, or we use them interchangeably, but they are actually different. So Companies that strive for workplace equality might not factor in the need for equity. For example, the entire workforce comes under the same blanket of rules and privileges without an eye on unique demographic related needs. And this may actually lead to an unfair work environment. Equity, on the other hand, requires an understanding of what each person needs and wants to be successful in the workplace, and then addressing those needs by bridging the gap between minority and majority groups. So, to provide an example, equality would be providing the same meal for everyone at the table. So, think surf and turf, knowing that you also have vegans and vegetarians in the group. So, technically, everybody received the same thing, it's equal. Equity, on the other hand, is providing vegan and vegetarian options along with the surf and turf meal so that everybody has something that they can eat. So equity not only means access to resources and opportunities, but also physical spaces and materials. And so for a moment, I want you all to envision the entrances to your workplace, or even your office space or your conference rooms. Are these spaces wheelchair accessible? If your policies and handbooks are available online, are those resources screen reader friendly for employees who may have impaired vision? These are all things to consider when you're trying to create an equitable work environment, not just an equal work environment. Next slide. So what is a disability? There are a couple different definitions. I'm most familiar with the legal definitions, which I'm sure is no surprise to any of you, but they can be quite instructive. So under the Americans with Disabilities Act, a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities is considered a disability. And the Center for Disease Control defines disability as any condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. So disabilities can affect a person's vision, movement, thinking, remembering, learning, communication, hearing, mental health, and it can also affect social relationships. So although individuals with disabilities sometimes refers to a single population, this is actually a very diverse group of people with a wide range of needs. So two people with the same type of disability can be affected in very different ways. And some disabilities may be hidden or are not able to see, but they are still just as much a disability as a physically apparent disability. Some things that are not a disability would include the common cold, flu, visual impairments corrected by glasses or contacts, a sprained ankle, use of illegal drugs, a minor broken bone, or a normal pregnancy. So those are just a few examples. Next slide, please. And there are three dimensions of disabilities. So we have impairment in a person's body structure, function, or mental functioning. So examples might include the loss of a limb, loss of vision, or memory loss. We have an activity limitation, such as difficulty seeing, hearing, walking, or problem solving. And then we have participation restrictions in normal daily activities, such as working, engaging in social and recreational activities, and obtaining healthcare and preventative services. Next slide. So neurodiversity, while it's only started coming to light as like a more frequently used term, has been around since the 1990s. So it was coined by Judy Singer, who's a sociologist who has autism, in the 1990s, but it's been springing up more and more in the media, and is more regularly used by physicians and the legal world alike. So neurodiversity is the range of differences in individual brain function and behavioral traits regarding as part of normal variation in the human population. So originally it was used especially in the context of autistic spectrum disorders. However, there are several examples of neurodiversity, including dyslexia, dyspraxia, attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, Tourette syndrome. Some include anxiety as neurodiversity. So these are just a few examples. But these individuals who are neurodiverse, it may be apparent outright, and it may not be. You might not know that an individual is neurodiverse. And actually, there was a case relatively recently that's demonstrative of legal penalties that employers can face when they're insensitive to the needs of neurodivergent employees. Um, a jury actually awarded an employee $450,000 after his employer ignored his request to not throw him a birthday party, because he informed them that it would result in a panic attack due to his anxiety disorder. And you read that and you might think, well, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but for somebody with severe anxiety disorder, that can be a huge stressor, being thrown into a situation where you're the center of attention and expected to participate and communicate. So the party was held during his lunch hour against his wishes, and he promptly left and ate his lunch in his vehicle. So the following day, he was criticized for his reaction to the party and told that he stole his coworker's joy, and that triggered another panic attack. Several days later, the employee was terminated via email, in which the company cited concerns regarding his behavior during the meeting following the unwanted birthday celebration, because they actually approached him after they left and said, "You're being ungrateful. What's this all about?" So the employee ended up suing his employer, alleging a failure to accommodate disability discrimination and retaliation, and the jury found in the employer's favor and awarded him that hefty sum. So neurodiversity is, again, just as much a disability as those that are maybe physically apparent or more readily apparent. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the ADA and some definitions of diversity, but now we're going to go over the legal framework. And I know that most people, when we talk about the law, their eyes kind of glaze over, but I like to think of it as a starting point for us and kind of a guide. So the legal framework sets the minimum standard of what's required, but we can always do more than that. So I like to start with the legal framework just to get us in this world of what we need to be doing so we can decide what can we be doing. Next slide. Okay, so Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination based on actual or perceived disabilities. It applies to private employers with 15 or more employees, but to all state and local government employers, regardless of how many employees you have. Title I requires that employers go through the interactive process and provide reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities. So, as with any reasonable accommodation made for an employee with a disability, accommodations do not require lowering your performance standards or eliminating essential job functions. Instead, it means modifying the work environment or the way in which tasks are completed to help employees successfully perform their job duties. And employers are required to make reasonable accommodations unless it would result in a hardship to the business. And that's all often kind of viewed as a fallback for employers, but we really want to make sure we're going through an analysis to determine, is this really a hardship? And the hardship standard varies with each case. So that's like a very lawyer answer. It depends, right? But it's just the fact of the matter. These are reviewed on a case-by-case basis, depending on the individual's need and the accommodations they're requesting. Generally, hardships may exist if the accommodation is difficult or expensive to achieve in relation to the size and the resources of the business. So if the accommodation is unduly costly or disruptive or would fundamentally alter the nature of the business, that may represent a hardship. Moving on to Title II of the ADA, this requires that state and local governments give peoples with disabilities an equal opportunity to benefit from all of their programs, services, and activities. And so I listed a number of examples of what those programs, services, and activities might be. And there's actually a split in courts on how and whether Title II is applicable to employees. However, there's a strong argument to be made that it is. And it's required regardless under Title I that we don't discriminate against employees based on their actual or perceived disabilities. So let's just look at Title II as another guide to help us reach the goal of the goals laid out in Executive Order number 92. Next slide. Okay, the Rehabilitation Act. So this is another federal law that generally prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies, programs receiving financial assistance, and federal employment, and in the employment practices of federal contractors. Section 503 requires affirmative action and prohibits employment discrimination by federal government contractors and subcontractors who have contracts of more than $10,000. And Section 504 provides that no qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall be excluded from, denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity that receives federal financing assistance. And as we all know, many state agencies do receive federal assistance, so this is something to keep in mind. Okay, next slide. All right, on to North Carolina. So I was so pleased to see, as I was preparing for this presentation, how robust North Carolina's state laws are on protections of individuals who are diverse. So North Carolina General Statute 126-16 is related to equal employment opportunities. So this says all state agencies, departments, and institutions and all local political subdivisions shall give equal opportunity for employment and compensation without regard to any of these protected characteristics listed. And then we have North Carolina General Statute 143-422.2, which is a mouthful, is for Equal Employment Practice Act. So employers who regularly employ 15 or more workers must give all persons the right and opportunity to seek, obtain, and hold employment without discrimination. Next slide. Next, we have North Carolina General Statute 168A-5, which is the Persons with Disabilities Protection Act. So we're narrowing things down a little bit, getting more specific. That provides it is a discriminatory practice for an employer to fail to hire or consider for employment or promotion, to discharge or otherwise discriminate against a qualified person with a disability on the basis of a disabling condition. You're prohibited from failing or refusing to refer for employment or otherwise discriminate against a qualified person with a disability on the basis of a disabling condition. And employers are prohibited from discriminating against a qualified person with a disability on the basis of a disabling condition in admission to or employment in a program established to provide apprenticeship or other training. Next slide. Okay, so the reason we're all here today, right? Executive Order number 92. There was a bit of an overview provided at the beginning, but this is really just going to be a refresher for you all. The order establishes North Carolina as an employment first state. And employment first is the principle that employment in the general workforce should be the first and preferred option for individuals with disabilities. And this order directs the state government to become a leader in recruiting and creating an inclusive job climate for workers with disabilities. It also directs the North Carolina Office of State Human Resources to collaborate with the Department of Health and Human Services to enhance recruitment and outreach efforts to workers with disabilities and to identify and attract qualified individuals with disabilities for state employment. And it also builds on the progress of Governor Cooper's efforts to create an inclusive work environment through Executive Order number 24, which prohibits discrimination generally in state employment. So again, we're working our way down into more narrow guidance, which I think is absolutely fantastic because diverse individuals, again, do not have the same needs. This is about equitable practices, not equal practices. Next slide. Okay. The employment first principles include that North Carolinians with disabilities can work in integrated settings and earn competitive wages and benefits. Individuals with significant disabilities can secure employment with reasonable and appropriate accommodations and support. So we discussed accommodations previously. Employees with and without disabilities are equally valued. And a job should match an individual's work skills, abilities, and career choices to the greatest extent possible. So these are just a couple of guidelines and things to strive for here. Next slide. The order also lays out several objectives. So this is great. This is our guidebook, right? This is our checklist. So this is where we go to figure out what we need to be doing. These objectives include improving recruitment and outreach efforts, enhancing the accessibility of employment applications and facilitating accommodations during the hiring process, implementing clear, reasonable workplace accommodation guidelines, which sounds simple, but you would be surprised how many times we run into a policy that is just very unclear and has a little bit of work to do, maybe a lot of work to do. Build upon existing state human resources training programs to improve the inclusion of individuals with disabilities in the workplace. Hey, that's what we're doing right now. Great job, everybody. We're on the way there. And identify opportunities for data collection to improve the state's hiring of individuals with disabilities. And then finally, there's a note in the order that says that this is applicable to state agencies, which is defined as any North Carolina department, agency, board, commission, or committee for which the governor has oversight responsibility. But it also encourages other entities not subject to state oversight to comply as well. And if I were a private employer, I would use this as my guidepost in determining what steps I can take to create a more inclusive work environment for individuals with disabilities. Next slide. So the executive order also has some action items. It directs state agencies to consult with OSHR and thereafter consistent with existing federal and state law to develop additional state agency specific plans and procedures necessary to implement the executive order and to periodically report on efforts to comply with and implement this executive order. So we are going to focus more so on the objectives today and how we can reach those objectives. Next slide. Okay, now we get into the fun stuff. I'm so excited. So first, recruitment. How do we attract candidates, right? Next slide. First, let's figure out what our applicant pool looks like. So there are over 2 million North Carolinians over the age of 18 who have a disability. So that is a quarter of North Carolina's population. So in sum, we have no excuses. Just kidding. Of course, there are barriers along the way, but we have a very large applicant pool of individuals with disabilities that we can be tapping into to utilize their talent in our workforce. And it's also important to note that disabilities are more common in older Americans. And so as our workforce gets older, the number of employees with disabilities will increase. Next slide. Okay. Attracting candidates. What can we do? Let's review our job postings. Are they accessible? That is a preliminary barrier for individuals with disabilities who are trying to apply for jobs. So, and an inaccessible online job application means you could be losing qualified candidates. So according to a survey by Pete in 2015, so this was a while back, 46% of respondents rated their experience for applying for a job online as difficult to impossible due to inaccessible features, including complex navigation, the content cannot be read by a screen reader or reading software, the inability to navigate with keyboard strokes versus moving a mouse, missing alternative text for images. And if you don't know what alternative text is, you're essentially describing any picture that's included or any logo that's included in your posting. Poor screen or text contrast. So if you have your application on like a blue screen with white text, that would be very, very challenging to read for anyone, particularly individuals who are who experience visual challenges. Captioning on all videos, and or the page has content that cannot be clearly read, or the application times out. And so it might take applicants longer to complete their applications, and maybe there's a time limit set and they're almost done, and then it comes up on the screen that their time limit has run and the page refreshes and they loses all their progress. Or there's no accommodation statement, or it's not listed, or it's not easy to find. And so they just automatically assume, well, this prospective employer isn't going to create an accommodation for me during this process, so I'm not even going to bother applying. Next, what words do you use? for your job requirements? What phrases are you using? What do your physical requirements look like? And are they absolutely necessary? So actually, Hush Blackwell just did a thorough review of its job postings because we realized that there were a number of requirements that we just didn't, they just weren't practical and they actually weren't requirements. And so must be able to lift 50 pounds. I'm sitting at my desk all day. I can lift 50 pounds, but is it necessary for my job? I've never had to lift 50 pounds for this job. So if you have any lifting restrictions, consider changing that language, removing it, or instead of saying must be able to lift 20 pounds, must be able to transport items from one place to another that weigh X amount, with or without the assistance of another individual, or with or without a reasonable accommodation. What about must be able to type? So this is one I see all the time. Consider changing this to must be able to communicate effectively or must be able to draft communications, because not everybody may have the capacity to physically type, but it doesn't mean that they can't create a work product. Must be able to speak effectively and clearly. Again, must be able to communicate effectively. And then finally, must be able to drive between multiple locations, must be able to transport from one location to another is something that we could do to change that language. So you just want to look out for ableist terms and phrases that might be included in your postings that are unintentionally discouraging individuals with disabilities to apply. You also want to include language indicating that accommodations will be made for applicants upon request. So pre-offer, you cannot ask people to self-disclose their disability. You cannot require them to do that. However, Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act requires federal contractors to invite applicants to self-identify at the pre-offer stage. This requirement was added so that contractors can track the number of individuals with disabilities who apply for jobs and then use this information to assess the effectiveness of their outreach and recruitment efforts. And so we also want to consider including a strong equal employment opportunity statement. And while words are just words, it can be demonstrative of your organization's commitment to employing diverse individuals. Next slide, please. Okay. Where are you posting? This is very important. So I think when people think of job postings, they think, you know, LinkedIn, monster.com, some of the other more standard job posting websites. Consider posting to job boards that are tailored specifically for individuals with disabilities. I listed a bunch here for you, but you can do some searching and figure out maybe we're not reaching the right candidates because we're not posting our job listings in the right places. Next slide. All right, so still in the attracting candidates step, partner with state and local service providers, such as the North Carolina Division of Vocational Rehabilitation Services, the American Job Centers, Centers for Independent Living, and the Disability and Veterans Community Resources. So they also hold diversity-focused virtual career fairs, such as Ability Job Fair, and this offers accessible online job fairs to help employers and job seekers with disabilities connect. So this can happen via video, text, chat, transcription, or ASL. They have all those options available. Next slide. Okay. So still attracting candidates. What are some other things that we can do? So you can establish a diversity brand. So this might include social media, updating your website, updating your print materials, but we want to make sure this is authentic and that we're not just doing this for show. So first step is to implement changes internally and make improvements internally, and then we can show that externally. It can be an incredibly useful recruiting tool for letting people know that this is a welcoming workplace and we want you. We want you to apply. You can also partner with student associations. So the National Association of Blind Students, Students with Diabetes, Do It, Disabilities, Opportunities, Internetworking and Technology, National Black Deaf Advocates, and Student Veterans of America. These are just a small sampling of student organizations that work with employers to get graduates ready for employment post-graduation, and to connect them with prospective employers, which is just so incredibly important. Next slide. And finally, for recruitment, consider doing an employee referral program. So encourage your current employees to refer qualified candidates. And what we see some clients do is they'll actually offer maybe a retention, or I'm sorry, a referral bonus, or it can be something as simple as, you know, a gift card for referring a candidate. It's a great hiring source in terms of volume and quality, and it's the fastest way to find external talent. And it's going to lower overall recruiting costs. So if you're working with a third party vendor who's helping with recruitment, maybe we just utilize our internal talent and find referrals that way. And when you bring somebody on as a referral, it often leads to better retention rates because they already know somebody within the organization who has likely hyped up the organization. So overall, it's just a really, really good idea to consider implementing an employee referral program, whether it's formal or informal. Next slide. Interviewing. Okay. So we've expanded our pool of applicants and have selected some candidates to undergo the interview process. What are some best practices that you can follow when it comes to actually conducting the interview? Next slide. Location. You want to identify and use accessible interview locations. And I know we did that visualization exercise before. And so if you can't think of a place that's accessible in your workplace, that's something we're going to have to think about. If you have an applicant who cannot make it into your workplace, that's a much larger issue. Consider those who use wheeled mobility devices. Is there parking nearby? Is there accessible parking nearby? Is there an accessible path to and from the interview location? Law offices can get very crazy, and sometimes we have boxes in the hallways, and make sure that everything is clear before the interviewer arrives so that it doesn't become something that makes them uncomfortable because you're already ready to go. And then offer online interviews where possible. So I know there is some pushback to doing things this way, and there is value of connecting in person, but if, for example, an individual requests an accommodation for a virtual interview, strongly consider that, because you may not know how much easier you are making it for that candidate just to get their foot in the door, so to speak. Next slide. Okay, interviewing continued. So when creating questions, we want to make sure to train interviewers, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more. You want to seek similar core information from every candidate, regardless of whether or not it's an individual with a disability or not. Have a procedure on how to handle uninvited information regarding protected characteristics, because sometimes people will voluntarily disclose during a meeting, and make sure that your notes that you're taking during the interview do not relate to a protected characteristic. That's just good advice all around. We want to avoid independent research. So we all know that everyone has Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all those accounts. And for the most part, we want to avoid that because it can create biases, and then it can impact your judgment of somebody before they even have the chance to come and interview with you. And speaking of bias, you want to understand and avoid unconscious bias. So unconscious bias is extremely hard to avoid, but you can recognize it when it's happening. One example, and I'll go over this in a little more detail, but one example I like to provide is I went to UW-Madison for undergrad and law school. Go Badgers. So I love the Badgers. So for me, if I see a candidate that went to UW-Madison, I have my rose-colored glasses on, and I have an affinity bias for that person, right? Because I automatically think, oh, they went to UW-Madison, I went to UW-Madison, they must be a good person. A little leap in logic there, right? So I have to recognize that bias within myself, take a step back and make sure I'm really assessing the candidate objectively and not based on my internal bias of individuals who also attended UW-Madison. So that's just one example. And then finally, where possible, use a diverse and inclusive interview panel. So we always prefer conducting interviews with at least 2 people because you're able to get multiple perspectives, and it can also help you identify bias that one interviewer may have that the other interviewer doesn't. And if you can do, 1 or 2 rounds, so 2 candidates per round, or I'm sorry, 2 interviewers per round, then you have a larger slate of comments to go through. You can have a discussion about the candidate, and it really helps to make sure that this individual is most well suited for the position. That doesn't mean that you should put every individual in your organization with a disability on the hiring panel. No, remember, we're looking at this broad definition of diversity, right? So we just want to include people with different perspectives, different backgrounds. Next slide. Okay, interviewing training. So we want to ensure that hiring managers understand disability etiquette. So, and I have some tips on that as well. But this is going to make sure to increase the comfort level of both your managers and your job candidates. So this might include a discussion on how certain candidates may present during the interview process. So individuals with autism may have challenges making eye contact consistently. And for someone who is not aware that this individual may have autism, you may perceive that as them not being interested, right? And so to the extent you know beforehand that that is not something that we're gonna discount this individual for, it's very important to understand that communication styles may differ amongst individuals with disabilities. You also want to ensure that the hiring managers focus the interview on the merits of the candidate and not whether they or not they have a disability. So this can result in unfounded assumptions about what a candidate with a disability can and cannot do, and that will lead to discrimination. We want to teach hiring managers about the reasonable accommodation process and other programs that might benefit employees. We want to educate hiring managers about what they can and cannot ask during the interview process as it relates to disability. So, and we want to practice those disclosure conversations so that they know what to do if the interviewee voluntarily discloses their disability. So say, for example, somebody comes in and they say, I have X disability or I have X condition. You can say, thank you for disclosing that. Do you need anything else to continue our interview? Or is there anything we can provide to help you continue the interview? We don't want to ask for details regarding the disability. What we can do is ask, could you explain for me how you would perform X task, which is one of the duties of your job, of this job description, or whatever the case might be. So we can ask them questions related to the actual position as we would with any other candidate. Can you explain to me how you would draft a memorandum on this topic, for example? Next slide. Okay, know your biases. So I mentioned one of mine, but if you schedule a candidate with a perfect resume for a phone interview and the candidate uses a relay call, does that change your perception of the candidate? Or if a qualified candidate applies for a customer service role and they have a speech impediment, are they less qualified than a candidate without one? Or if a candidate has a visible disability, shouldn't they tell me exactly what it is? These are all biases. And remember that you cannot ask questions that are likely to reveal a disability during an interview. Instead, you can ask, can you perform the essential functions of this job with or without a reasonable accommodation? Next slide. Okay, the interview. We want to ensure accommodations requested are in place before the candidate arrives. Visit the interview location prior to conducting the interview to ensure it meets the candidate's needs. We want to check in with the candidate to see if they have what they need to fully participate in the interview. Ask job-related interview questions and those relevant to job functions. Focus on how the applicant plans to be effective in their position. Remember, no questions that are likely to reveal a disability. use a diverse panel of interviewers, and relax. Try to relax. Everyone gets nervous with interviews. Don't let fear of mistakes impact your ability to connect with the interviewee. We all make mistakes. I still make them every day. Best practice is if you are corrected by someone, say, thank you so much, and then you move on. Because if you apologize profusely and you linger on it, it makes it uncomfortable for everyone, particularly the individual who had to do the correcting. So just keep that in mind. Next slide. Okay, appropriate interview questions. So they should relate to the requirements of the job, elicit information regarding the qualifications you seek. You can ask questions about leaving prior employment. Here's a number of examples for you. I might skip ahead a little bit because I know we want to leave time for questions. So here's some interviewing etiquette. So feel free to review these in your time prior to conducting interviews. So consider being more descriptive and specific when giving directions to a candidate who's blind or low vision. Have paper and pen handy for those where it might be helpful to write something out. Always ask if somebody needs assistance before just offering, because they can likely do things themselves. If they've lived with this condition in their entire life, they probably won't need help and they might not want help. Next slide. Don't pretend, next slide, please. Thank you. Don't pretend to understand what somebody said if you don't understand. It's okay to ask people to repeat what they said. It's also okay for you to shake a candidate's prosthetic limb if they extend it, right? But you can also greet them with a smile or nod if they may not be comfortable with that. And then if they bring their service animal, do not touch them. They're working, they're on the job, and we don't want to interrupt their job, just like you wouldn't want somebody interrupting you when you're doing your job. Okay, moving on to retention. Next slide, thank you. And next slide. Great. Okay, so these next two slides contain some recommendations for programming or onboarding for employees. And this is applicable to all employees, not just individuals with disabilities. And so review your onboarding and orientation for accessibility, consider implementing mentorship programs, review your compensation packages and perks, consider wellness offerings, and if there are wellness offerings, make sure that there are alternatives available for individuals with all abilities. We want to have solid communication with our employees. If there's a performance issue, tell them, have a conversation about it. Next slide. We also want to make sure there's some training and development in place for all employees. Provide employee recognition and rewards to recognize those outstanding employees who are doing an excellent job. We want to try to create a work-life balance or integration, consider flexible work arrangements, which can be particularly useful for individuals with disabilities, and emphasize teamwork. Next slide. Okay. So it's also very helpful to encourage self-disclosure through voluntary surveys. People might not voluntarily disclose for fear of stigma, unconscious biases, discrimination, if they don't realize the definition of disability. So when you are creating a voluntary disclosure survey, think about how you're going to define disability. Our company, Hush Blackwell, expanded the definition of disability to include anxiety and depression and a couple other disabilities. And the percentage of self-disclosure increased exponentially after expanding that definition, because people saw, oh, maybe I am an individual with this disability. I do have this particular condition. Regularly communicate the importance of inclusion and diversity to employees, and that should come from the top down. We want to recognize and celebrate disability awareness months and days. We want to offer resources like disability etiquette and implicit bias trainings, and learn the language. Do your best to learn the language. It's not an individual with a disability's responsibility to teach you best practices. You can do your own research. So it's individuals with disabilities, not disabled, handicapped, special needs, or differently abled. And most of these terms were acceptable at one point. So remember that. Things are ever changing and it's okay to make mistakes. Neurodivergent, not our word, weird, different, off. And avoid ableist terms like blind spot, idiot, lame, or psycho. And these things take practice. You have to be very deliberate about it. And don't use popularized phrases like, I'm so ADD, when you can't stay focused on a task because it's just insensitive, right? Next slide. So these are the categories of accessibility. We're going to skip over this today just for purposes of time and go on to the next slide. And we're going to go on to creating accessible workplaces. So when possible, you want to provide an employee's requested accommodation, but know that you're not required to provide their top preference, right? Their top choice. You're able to work with an employee. But where possible, we want to give them the accommodation that they've requested. So some examples might include having a designated private, quiet space in an office building, providing flexible work schedules or telecommuting, adjustable desks, or allowing employees to wear headphones at their desks. But aren't accommodations expensive? Actually, no, not most of the time. So the majority of accommodations cost less than $500, and 59% of accommodations cost nothing at all. And proactive accommodations benefit everyone, not just individuals with disabilities. Next slide. Now, one of the objectives of the executive order was also to determine new ways to collect data to measure progress. And so we always go with a data-driven approach. This can be done by surveys of your employees to discover issues and progress that you've made. You can measure your turnover and the cost that it's had on the organization. You can also get effective sponsorship, mentorship programming in place. So the senior level executive that advocates for the employee would be a sponsor. A mentor more advises the employee on their day-to-day. And then you want to think about career development and succession planning as well. Next slide. Continuing with collecting data. So you can use metrics to monitor your recruiting efforts. So of course, we only know if people voluntarily disclose because we cannot ask about disabilities, but that's where that statement indicating that you can provide an accommodation may come in handy because people may say, I do need an accommodation. And then you can ask, okay, what accommodation do you need? So you can track the percent of candidates with disabilities at each recruiting stage, the percent of employees with disabilities at different levels within your company. So that's all done through these voluntary self-disclosure surveys, the percentage of accommodations granted annually, and employee satisfaction scores in terms of diversity and inclusion. And then you can also measure your retention rates within the company. So how many employees are we losing every year? How many of those employees are diverse? How many of those employees are individuals with disabilities? Next slide. Okay, here are a number of other diversity inclusion initiatives that apply across the board. Again, reviewing your policies and procedures. You can create an internal task force. You want to promote trainings and events for diverse employees, and you want to ensure senior level buy-in and support. Next slide. More specifically, we want to strengthen anti-discrimination policies like your equal employment opportunity policy. Consider including more protected classes than required by law. And then a detailed policy for requesting accommodations with a point of contact, and then also an expected turnaround time. So we will get back to you within X amount of days after you submit a request for accommodation. And then you want to make sure your policies are accessible to all employees, because if they can't access them, they won't know what to do. Next slide. Employee resource groups and affinity groups can also be incredibly impactful. We have them here at Huff Blackwell. I'm the co-chair of our employee resource groups for Hispanic and Latina attorneys and business professionals, and it just creates this unmatched community of like-minded individuals with similar backgrounds, and it can be so instrumental in retaining employees who are diverse, no matter their dimension of diversity. Next slide, and next slide. So we have some benefits here that I discussed. Next slide. And here is our homepage for our workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion practice. I co-chair the group with Eric Eisenman, who's also the chair of our labor and employment practice. And if you go to the next slide, you can see some of our services that we offer here. They're listed. I won't read them all for you, but we can assist at every level, no matter where you're at in your DEI journey. Next slide. I have some of my team members here, just wonderful, wonderful colleagues across the board. Next slide. And the remainder of our team here, all incredible humans. And the last slide. We are ready for questions. I know I kind of sped through the end there, so please, if you have any more questions on creating inclusive cultures, feel free to send those my way.
This time I'm going to look in the chat and see if we have any questions. And first of all, Katarina, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very engaging and informative. And I have, I'll start out with a question. You talked a little bit about the voluntary, um, self-identification.
Mhm.
And there are challenges, it seems, all the time to get people to self-disclose. Do you have any possible things that we could do to encourage employees to self-disclose?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the primary barriers is that people are concerned that maybe the information will be shared more widely than perhaps they would like, or they don't themselves identify as any of the categories listed. And so one of the things you can do is have leadership within your organization, whatever that looks like, say, and encourage people to fill out the voluntary disclosure and say, you know, I have filled this out. I'm very excited about this initiative and about gathering more data so we can better serve you, our employees, our staff. And then you can also say you can inform employees of the purpose for collecting the information and saying you can elect to keep this completely confidential. So the way that we use it in Hush is to pair people with employee resource groups that they might align with. And so if you identify as Hispanic or Latino, and you also consent to having the ERGs receive that information, you will be invited to their programming. But there's also an option to say, I don't consent to releasing this information outside the scope of providing it for, you know, tracking or data purposes, right? So for those employees who might not feel comfortable disclosing more broadly, you can include an option that the data is only used for tracking purposes and won't be released to their colleagues. And it's also just about creating a culture where your employees feel comfortable to do that. And so I know I discussed a lot of ways that you can do that, and it takes time. When we first released our self-identification survey, it did not get a ton of traction until a couple months later, and our leadership just continued to mention it internally. And we kept getting reminder emails saying, if you have not voluntarily disclosed, please consider doing so. It really helps us figure out how to help you. And so those can be a few effective ways to encourage participation. And then with respect to disabilities specifically, being more detailed in your definition of what disability includes. And so I had provided the example of us including depression and anxiety under the definition of disability. And I have a strong feeling that that is one of the major reasons why individuals were more inclined to check that box, because they thought, oh, actually, I align with that.
Katarina, it's Lisa Coffee. I have a question. Regarding the mental health disorders and the pandemic, I feel like there was obviously a rise in it. How did that play out in the workforce? Did you see any changes or
Yes.
trends?
It sounds like you know the answer to that question.
No, I don't. Not really.
So,
Officially.
so yes, we absolutely did see some trends. I think it's more widely known that racially diverse individuals were impacted by the pandemic, and women were also seen leaving the workforce as a result of the pressures of the pandemic. The same was the case for individuals with disabilities, whether that be physical disabilities or neurodiversity. And I think there was also this increase in employees who may not identified as having or being neurodiverse now identifying as neurodiverse because they've developed anxiety over the course of the last 3 years, which is frankly to be expected when you're trapped in a house for over a year. So we certainly saw the impacts of that. And I think employers are still navigating the impacts of that. We have requests for accommodation coming in all the time that employees continue to work remotely. And that's something we have to really grapple with. We do see some pushback from our clients saying, no, they need to be here in person. And then when we kind of dig down on that, okay, why? There's not always a good answer. And so it impacted the workforce in a number of ways, and those are just a few. Those are just a few of them.
Right. I know. I mean, we don't have time to go into all of them, but I just
We could spend
wondered if
another
it
hour on
really
that topic.
was an issue still at this point in time.
Absolutely. And it just means that um, we need to provide people with grace and patience,
Right.
and really try to meet our employees where they're at and understanding that we are still coming out of a pandemic. So we should make our workspaces a collaborative and welcoming place, and that includes understanding that some of your employees may be suffering from anxiety or depression and things that you can't see.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
And what you're saying is very true, because I mean it's foundational to Executive Order 92 when you're talking about hiring, recruiting, hiring, and retaining and promoting employees with disabilities or individuals with disabilities. Part of that is retention, and if you are able to accommodate, that's the main thing in keeping individuals with disabilities, with keeping them engaged as an employee and making them feel welcome in their workplace. So that's just very, very true. And I'm going to take this time to again see if there are any other questions,
Sure.
because you covered so many topics,
I
and
know.
it was very informative, and a lot of helpful examples. That's a lot of the feedback I'm getting from employees in the chat,
Right.
and I just appreciate all of the things that you gave, or the examples that you gave, especially with the etiquette. I think sometimes we don't look at those issues and how we engage with employees that have disabilities enough. So again, thank you for that. And I also would like to take this moment to thank you, Katerina, for presenting today, but also for our ASL interpreters. I would like to take this time to thank both of you for interpreting today. Our interpreters from the Interpreter Network, Christine, Neil, Hale, and Karen Cook. I would like to thank both of you, and also for our CART captioner from Carolina's Captioning. So for anyone that utilized those services today, I would like to say thank you to all of you for coming and providing those services today. And also thank you to our speaker. And at this time, this will conclude our program. And if there are any other questions, just feel free to shoot me an email and I will get that information back to you. But this program will be posted very soon. Again, this is the 4th anniversary of Executive Order 92. We are committed to being an employer of choice for individuals with disability. And again, I would just like to encourage everyone to hire, recruit, retain employees that have disabilities. This will conclude our program, and thank you for spending your time, your lunch hour with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.